The Second Reconstruction, African Americans from 1954 to 1968. During the Reconstruction period following the Civil War, the nation focused its attention on the plight of the newly freed ex-slave. Americans amended the U.S. Constitution 3 times, ending slavery and extending citizenship and voting rights to African Americans. Concern for the freed men lasted only a short time, and by 1876 the nation turned its attention to other pressing issues. Federal troops left the South and Democrats redeemed Southern states by establishing Jim Crow segregation there. Not until the 1950s and 60s did the American people again consider the dreadful situation black citizens faced in the segregated Southern states. The Second Reconstruction period, lasting from 1954 to 1968, desegregated Southern life and brought African Americans into the nation's political process. African Americans in the post-World War II period increased their efforts to end segregation, and so too did the Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall and lawyers for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, filed school desegregation lawsuits in the late 1940s, hoping that the High Court would reverse the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson decision that had established the legal doctrine of separate but equal. The NAACP's most important case involved young Linda Brown, a black schoolgirl in Topeka, Kansas, who could not legally attend an all-white school near her house. In its landmark 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision, the Supreme Court struck down the legal foundation of segregation, concluding that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. The arrest of Rosa Parks in late 1955 for refusing to move to the back of a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, soon tested the scope of this ruling. Alabama's segregation laws forced African American bus riders to yield their seats to white passengers, and Parks, a secretary for the NAACP office in Montgomery, deliberately tested the unfair law. In response to her arrest, legal and religious leaders in Montgomery's black community decided to boycott city buses, an effective strategy since most of the riders were African Americans. Within a year, Montgomery desegregated city transportation. The emergence of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. as the boycott's organizer and spokesperson was also a major gain for the cause of African Americans. As civil rights progressed, however, resistance intensified. In March 1956, 81 U.S. representatives and 19 senators issued the Southern Manifesto, a segregationist document praising the motives of those states which have declared the intention to resist forced integration by any lawful means. When Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, prepared to admit its first black student in 1957, segregationist Governor Orville Faubus placed National Guardsmen around the campus. He later dismissed the troops, leaving the Little Rock Nine defenseless. President Dwight Eisenhower had to send federal troops to Little Rock to protect African American students entering school buildings. Central High School closed the following year rather than continue court-ordered integration. College students began a period of civil rights activism and protest using nonviolent means in the early 1960s. In February 1960, 4 African American students sat at a segregated lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. Hundreds of student demonstrators had joined the sit-in, but success came only after months of arrests and boycotts of stores with segregated lunch counters. In May 1961, groups of interracial college students took bus trips into southern states to see if bus stations and terminals there were obeying new laws requiring integrated waiting areas. Segregationists greeted these freedom rides with mob violence, especially in Alabama and Mississippi, and U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy had to use federal marshals to guarantee their safety. Peaceful protests for civil rights reached their high point on August 28, 1963, when more than 200,000 Americans gathered at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. to urge civil rights for African Americans and hear Dr. King's "I Have a Dream" speech. After President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, Lyndon B. Johnson dedicated his new presidency to social reform and civil rights. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 became law with his signature and immediately increased the number of African American voters throughout the former Confederate States. Free to cast their ballots without hindrance or harassment, black voters elected local officials, state legislators, mayors, governors, and members of Congress more closely attuned to their interests. Overshadowing these civil rights doctrines were race riots that hit African American cities in 1965, 67, and 68. On August 11, 1965, a riot broke out in the Watts section of Los Angeles after police arrested a 21-year-old African-American male for a traffic violation. An estimated 30,000 rioters caused $40 million worth of damage, and similar upheavals occurred in Detroit and other cities in 1967. A presidential commission lay blame for the rioting on the racial attitude and behavior of white Americans towards black Americans. After a white assassin killed Dr. Martin Luther King on April 4, 1968, race riots broke out again in more than 130 black neighborhoods across the country. Because of protests against the increasingly unpopular Vietnam War, President Johnson announced in spring 1968 that he would not seek re-election. His successor, Richard M. Nixon, won the White House on a law and order campaign and pledged to protect the first civil right of every American, to be free from domestic violence. His election marked the end of a liberal era and the beginning of another more conservative one. Although the nation gradually moved away from civil rights reform by 1968, African Americans held on to the gains they made during the Second Reconstruction years.